But at this point, over to you, Toni, and very welcome, a warm welcome at UCL.
Thank you so much, Uta, for inviting me. It's been sort of a year in the making and us trying to negotiate a time. So I'm really pleased that I can be with you this evening, although a bit sad that it can't be in person. What I wanted to do is speak for perhaps about 30 minutes, because I'd much rather have a discussion. And I'll preface this by saying this is based on a paper that I'm co-authoring with a colleague at University College in Cork and another at the University of Lisbon, Niall Dungan and Louis Mar, respectively. And our collaboration comes off of an edited book that we've just done on EU-Africa relations, where we're trying to take stock. And this, in a way, this presentation is also about taking stock, but also trying to understand what the relationship means now, and also sort of looking at the future in the context where African agencies becoming, I guess, a bit more prominent than I would say used to. And so I'll start with a bit of history, take you into the more, I guess, wonky bits of EU-Africa relations, and then argue that the current relationship is one, I think, that is beset by certain levels of anxiety, particularly on the part of the EU, and speak through the ways in which we see those anxieties, and then look at some of the reactions to those, and then what that means going forward. So for those of us who've obviously studied the Treaty of Rome in detail, I honestly don't expect anybody to have. When you sort of think about those first 6 members of the European Economic Community who sort of took that initial step towards integration, they agreed in the treaty to associate with non-European countries and territories that have special relations with Belgium, France, Italy, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom. To my mind, and I've made this argument before, and I think quite a few other people make that argument, that, the meaning here is very clear, that, colonies and soon to be former colonies, even when the United Kingdom was not a member, were considered in the future, in what was to become the European Union. So that relationship between what is now the EU and Africa is actually inscribed into the European integration process. And I think, there are sort of 2 perhaps main reasons for this. First is that, underpinning the relationship between the EU and Africa are colonial logics of interaction. In the context of our work, we don't say that or articulate that as a theory, but rather as a fact, based on the evidence, the historic evidence, including the Treaty of Rome. So this is not necessarily a theoretical stance. I'm not going to be presenting a post-colonial theoretical approach, but rather I think that it is fair to articulate it as such, which of course is slightly counterintuitive because of course the European Union itself was not a colonial power. But I also think it's important to reflect on that inscription of Africa into European integration, because I think it is also counterintuitive to the myth that EU only started doing foreign policy in the 1990s, particularly in the context of the CFSP, because primarily sort of development and was looked at as being separate. But I would actually say, well, actually, we should question, so this is also about knowledge production, we should question this idea that we didn't have, the EU didn't really do foreign policy or was not considered a strong foreign policy actor until recently. And what does it mean to sort of exclude its practices, whether we like it or not, in Africa from that particular narrative? I think this is further reinforced if consideration is given to the intent of the relationship. So going back to the treaty to promote the economic and social development of the countries and territories, and to establish close economic relations between them and the community as a whole. So the inclusion of former colonies into the integration framework is significant because these almost independent countries didn't actually have a say in the context of the Treaty of Rome. So how would we categorize that relationship? I think in articulating the possibilities of a post-colonial relationship, then, we see manifested a coloniality of power that is being articulated and characterized by unevenness and exploitation, and whose rhetoric commitment to change simply reinforced existing dynamics. And I think why this is important is that it satisfies what the EU was, and to an extent is looking for in its relationship with Africa. In a way, when we sort of think about the security of the European Union in an ontological sense, the relationship, that status quo is contingent, ontological security is contingent on this particular type of dynamic with the European, between Africa and the European Union. And of course, that is then exported to African institutions as well. And colleagues like Olivia Ritazibwa, who've worked specifically on this idea of international development, have tended to sort of critique the sort of the dynamic of that relationship. So again, this is not, I'm not necessarily saying anything new, but I think presently it's fair to say that the current relationship is not what it used to be. So the argument here isn't that nothing has changed. I think that change has happened in sort of fits and starts, but this change has continued to work to the EU's advantage in a way that it is able, again, to sort of secure its own sense of self in the way that it doesn't necessarily negate how it understands itself in international relations. I should say that this doesn't necessarily negate some benefit to African partners, just that if we look historically at that relationship, whereas we can point to certain harms that have come about as a result of that relationship in Africa, we can't necessarily do the same for the EU. Now, I understand that this is debatable, particularly when we look at recent narratives around migration from the part of the EU, but I will come back to this in a moment. I would say that, you know, over the last, you know, 5 decades or so, the EU has really leaned into the power hierarchies that existed between Europe and Africa before the formation of the community. And this hierarchy, of course, has largely disadvantaged Africans. But of course, a part of the change that has started to build also has to do with the formation of new institutions, and in particular, the African Union, who is positioning itself as a main interlocutor for Africa, thereby opening the space to reorient relations between the EU and Africa, and giving space to articulate African agency much more constructively. At the same time, the existence of the African Union also expands the space for the types of engagements that the EU can have in Africa. So moving away from simply sort of trade and aid to sort of thinking about peace and security, a space where we can definitely see Africa exercising its agency, but we can also sort of see the EU trying to circumvent the African Union's agency in this particular area. So as of 2021, I would argue that there is a bid to redefine the relationship and to acknowledge that it is time to sort of think more strategically about that relationship. And part of why this is happening, and it's not happening well, is because the African side is now quite adamant that it will no longer tolerate the status quo, that the sort of incremental changes that have happened in the relationship has not been to the substantive benefit of Africans. And now, and I think this is really important, there are more options on the part of Africans than I think there used to be. But of course, in parallel to this is that there's a lot that is making the EU very anxious about its own self, right? So in the UK, of course, Brexit has had an impact. The impact of the financial crisis is there, and of course, the migration crisis, amongst other things. And COVID certainly challenges the EU's understanding of itself as well. So a lot is happening to the EU here in Europe, if we can use that argument. But I think a lot is also happening to the EU in the context of its relationship with Africa. On the one hand, it has to do with sort of this, we want to create more space for ourselves in this relationship on the part of the Africans. But a second bit of that is also exogenous, and it's coming from the closer and closer relationship of a lot of African countries and African regional institutions to China specifically. And so, you know, to sort of fast forward to the end a bit, and I'll come back to the beginning, what we've seen is that a lot of the reactionary engagements that the EU has participated in sort of the last 3-4 years, it's almost like it's more of a reaction to China in Africa rather than to demands of Africans. And I think that poses a problem. So what I wanted to do in sort of that long lead-in is to very briefly go over just to give a background to how the relationship has evolved, and then to talk a bit more and here leaning a lot on the work of Kinval, Mitson, and Manners, who talk a lot about ontological security and the ways in which that has manifested in the context of Europe, and to then expand this a bit by then looking at, one relationship that has been more or less constant is this EU-Africa relationship, and it is fraying and it's a bit fractured, which I think compounds that ontological insecurity, and then sort of look at what the responses to that have been and what the implications are, and how we can, how do we then make sense of everything going forward, because this is not a relationship that Africa, the EU are necessarily keen to leave. It's just that it cannot go on as it has been. So I should say I'm still thinking about what the concrete conclusions are, but and I'm really open to hearing from others what they think. So the literature has established quite well since that moment of that inscription of Africa into the Treaty of Rome, the academic work that has been done has been very clear that the relationship is asymmetrical. And yet we know that at almost every juncture when it comes to renegotiating or negotiating a new agreement between the EU and Africa, this is something that both sides talk about. So, whether it's Yaoundé or Lomé, which were the initial sort of economic agreements, it was very clear that the Africans were not happy, and at least rhetorically, it was very clear from the EU's side that, asymmetrical relations were not great. And yet in 2021, we are still literally talking about the same things. But in 2000, when the EU sort of decided that, around the 1990s, new negotiations started, and there was a lot of clarity around the fact that not only is this relationship asymmetrical, in the period that the EU has been engaged in Africa and has talked about social development and economic partnership, it seems as if the things that the EU actually cares about in development policy actually got worse. So increased poverty on the continent, conflict. And I think that this was part of why it was disturbing, I think, on the part of the EU, is because, it's always promoted this model of, this is what regional integration can do. It can bring sort of peace. And so if you just did that a bit better, and this is part of why the EU was quite insistent that its engagement with Africa would take place in this sort of trans-regional community of the African, Caribbean, and Pacific states, where the main things that bound all of those countries together, say between Africa, the Pacific, and the Caribbean, was that they were previously colonized countries. And even within that space, right, so those countries did try to come together to sort of articulate a position vis-a-vis the European Union. But by and large, there was the sense that the EU still got its way. So in 2000, still under the aegis of the African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries, there was an expansion of simply, we're not just going to talk trade and aid anymore, but actually think substantively about the implications of this. So there was a reinforcement of conditionalities. So all this while, the EU has been very extractive in its engagement with these countries. And then come 2000, 1990s, 2000, it simply wants conditionality. So you do human rights well, we continue to engage with you in very specific ways. So in that context, it still very much felt like the EU was calling the shots. That is not to suggest that, Africans are somehow against human rights or democracy or anything like that. But there was always a sense, even when this relationship had the space to expand, that the EU was still making the decisions. And so by 2005, again, there was a sense that, okay, so the whole Cotonou thing hasn't been so successful, we really needed to think about that. And what the EU, and particularly the Commission, did was they drafted a document called the European Strategy for Africa, which on the face of it sounds good. And in any case, when we sort of think about foreign policy, we draft foreign policy for ourselves, how we want the world to see us. We don't necessarily have to take into account what others think about us. But I think what is important to note is that the EU has always positioned itself as being very different, right? It's always tried to say we're very different from the member states. We didn't colonize anybody. We want what's good in the world. We want to be ethical, and importantly, we want to be normative, and we want partners, not just sort of recipients of our aid. And so in creating this strategy, the EU did articulate a shift away from a sort of donor-recipient logic of the relationship, which would now be founded on the 3 principles of equality, ownership, and partnership. And I think this is a really important rhetorical shift. And I think most of the literature would agree that this is the case. But of course, the problem with the 2005 strategy is that there was absolutely no engagement with the African side about what that would actually mean. And the African side did not have anything to say about, what definition are we putting into this if we actually really care that, we want to upend this asymmetrical relationship. And so actually for many, even though the EU was effectively admitting that it hadn't always done things right, this simply reinforced the argument that this was the sort of colonial logics of interaction were being sort of replayed over and over again. And so the strategy was very much derided by African political elites and seen as largely illegitimate for change, given the way that it was developed. And the EU's response to that was to actually acknowledge that, yes, that is probably right. And all we can use the 2005 strategy for is as an internal guide, and that if we actually wanted a proper strategy with African interlocutors, we had to sort of have consultations and sort of rethink how we actually engaged. And so a process of 2 years of consultations happened, and sort of similar to around the time the Lisbon Treaty was being signed, a new agreement was signed also in Lisbon between the EU and Africa, this time kind of acknowledging new African institutions like the African Union. And this joint Africa-EU strategy is not legally binding in the same way that Cotonou is. And I think there's a lot to be made of that. And in the paper, we will talk about that quite a bit, because when it's not legally binding, you cannot hold either side to it. And yet Cotonou is still legally binding, which is the one that is sort of crafted in this sort of asymmetrical, in this asymmetrical relationship. At the same time, though, of course, the world around is also changing, and that change is also certainly happening in Africa, where leaders are demanding more of their regional institutions, but also demanding more of their external partners, not the least the EU. At this point, though, I would say in 2007, and actually even now, the EU is still more or less regarded as a privileged partner. But there's a sense that things cannot go on as they used to, particularly if the EU's engagement in Africa is one that is intended to sort of stifle African agency. So why would there be this assumption that the EU's engagement in Africa is such that it stifles African agency? Well, I would argue that the things that sort of European scholars or scholars of the European Union now claim to be the basis of the EU's ontological insecurity. As I mentioned earlier, things like the so-called migration crisis, the financial crisis and its aftermath, and indeed now COVID, are read, and the way that the EU is reacting to those are problematic for the African Union on the one hand, but also African countries on the whole. It's problematic for their exercise of agency. But things didn't just start with COVID, and they certainly did not just start in sort of 2008. It went all the way back to how, the EU wanted to renegotiate Cotonou in the context of, this newly defined relationship in the joint Africa-EU strategy. But the EU was insisting that the economic partnership agreement would be on its own terms. So Africans, for example, wanted to negotiate as a continent. The EU said, no, you want to negotiate as sub-regions, okay? But those sub-regions did not necessarily map on to the recognized regional economic communities, which are deemed as sort of building blocks to the African Union. On the other hand, the European Union has decided that issues around terrorism is a problem on the continent because of the sort of knock-on effect of pushing people out of their homes, creating internally displaced people, and of course then sort of being a push factor for migration into Europe. Again, obvious partners are very clear, the African Union and existing regional organizations. But the sort of European Union, including member states, have decided, well, actually, the thing to fund is, for example, formerly ad hoc sort of regional body, G5 Sahel, where they're really championing G5 Sahel, and that has led to increased militarizations in the EU's engagement with Africa. Again, trying to circumvent the sort of voice of agency in the African context. Now, to sort of look at this in the sort of the ontological security context, which as I said earlier, I sort of draw on the work of Kinval, Manas, and Mitson, where the EU is in crisis, in multiple crises. And this crisis have sort of heightened the European fears and anxieties. And so I think where ontological security is useful is that it helps us make sense of these fears and anxieties by providing leverage for understanding how these anxieties at the EU level have psychosocial political effects that shape policy debates. And we certainly see this in the context of how the EU continues to approach Africa, even while making rhetorical claims about wanting to change the relationship. So I would say that an effect of this, both the way that the EU is sort of reacting in Africa to things that it sort of fears and it's anxious about, is that what Africans want has been very much diminished from the priority of the EU. It's been so, whereas we were sort of moving towards this, how do we make this relationship more equal? How do we make this relationship less colonial? When the EU actually reacts, it's very much about the European Union and what it is that the European Union assumes and wants, rather than what it is that the European Union can do with the African Union, with other African partners. And we especially see this. So even when we move away from looking at issues of migration, for example, where you sort of see a direct relationship, where we really see this heightened is that the EU's worry around China's influence on the continent. Now, there are lots of examples of ways in which initially the EU tried to sort of have a trilateral relationship, and the Africans were quite open to that, and so were the Chinese. But of course, given everything we knew about sort of the existing relationship between China and the European Union, this didn't really take off. So you do have that platform, but it hasn't really taken off. But of course, at the same time, what we've seen is sort of accelerated regionalism in Africa. For example, the creation of the African Continental Free Trade Area would have been something that would be actually more consistent with what the EU has promoted as part of its own identity. And the EU, again, rhetorically and in terms of financial support, has given money to the Continental Free Trade Area. But the current architecture of the Continental Free Trade Area does not match on to what the EU intends in the context of the economic partnership agreements, where the Continental Free Trade Area is about the whole continent, and the economic partnership agreements is about sort of breaking the continent into this predetermined sort of subsections that the EU is determining for itself. And so in the context of the work that we're doing, we go into the different ways in which the EU sort of tries to circumvent these changes that are happening within Africa, mainly in a very reactionary way to what it assumes might be a problem or might pose a problem to its ontological security. But of course, the EU's ontological security in this context was always at the expense of Africans and Africa having a particular type of relationship with it. And so it feels that, although there's a lot of forum for having conversations and having multilateral conversations where interests might align, whether it's on climate change, for example, or the ways in which, trade can facilitate growth or well-being. What has tended to happen is that increasingly it's just more and more clashes. And so, for example, in 2020, so this past year, there was supposed to be kind of a revisiting of the Cotonou Agreement and a replacement for the Cotonou Agreement, which both the EU and the African Union have been preparing for about 5 years. And here you have the African Union saying it is now time for the ACP, the African, Caribbean, and Pacific group, to no longer exist as it currently does, not just because it was something that the Europeans formed for the specific purpose of engaging with these countries, but because it no longer was useful if we're talking about a new strategic relationship with Africa and where we don't actually see any sort of similarities there. And the EU's come back to that was, okay, we can see how there are differentiations between the Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific groups. So how about we still keep that grouping, but then we have Africa underneath that ACP grouping? And the Africans are saying, but this doesn't make any sense because we've got the African Union. We're now having the free trade area. Is that not consistent with everything you've told us about, the ways in which you open up borders to have peace and, all the great things you've told us about regional integration? But again, the EU comeback is, no, that doesn't really work for us because we really want the economic partnership agreements. And a lot of resistance to that in Africa. And so what the EU has tended to do, and we got this from interviews, is it goes to individual countries and tries to get them to say, well, actually, maybe we don't want to do that through the African Union. We want to still do that through the ACP, which of course undermines regional integration, which is problematic for the Africans. But I think the bigger story here is that it becomes the antithesis of everything that the EU has said has been a good thing about Europe itself. So from our perspective, we see that the EU is in a way acting quite recklessly in trying to maintain this order, even though it's saying, well, actually, we want change, but we want change on our own terms. And when we say we want change in our own terms, we just really don't want things to change that much. And I just want to conclude there because, as I said earlier, it's still we're still sort of trying to wrap our heads around, what does this all mean? And in particular, what does this mean going forward? Because indeed, the EU has been a privileged partner for Africans. I don't think that, we are coming to a situation where the African Union or individual African countries will say, I'm sorry, we're no longer going to deal with the EU. And we know that, for example, in recent instances of public diplomacy, particularly around COVID vaccine, we see that the EU has, through the Commission, has really been trying to ensure that it's quite visible, especially vis-a-vis other actors. And when it talks about sort of this multilateral order where it's obviously positioning itself in relation to other actors within the international system, it certainly wants to take African countries along with it. And it continuously seeks partnerships and engagement on specific issue areas. But when we sort of look more broadly, this tension doesn't seem to be able to resolve itself between the EU seeking its own, or sort of assuaging its own anxieties and fears, but actually being responsive to what is now needed in the context of the relationship. And I think as the mechanisms and the capacities within the African context become more rooted, so that the articulation of African agency is clearer in the creation of these mechanisms, but also being able to say, well, actually, this is what we want and this is what we need, that this divide between the African side and the European side are perhaps more likely to grow. And I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this a fascinating talk and taking us on the whirlwind tour, as well as sort of very clearly this kind of theoretical approach, which I find fascinating, on ontological insecurity and anxiety. And I think there's a lot that we can expand on. We are beginning to see some questions in the chat and the Q&A, and I do encourage you to continue, but let me really abuse my position in this case of the chair to ask you just a follow-on question to the very sort of last constellation that you've begun to outline. It is really for me to learn and understand more about the relationship as you outline it, and that is specifically on the actors on the African side. You've very clearly shown sort of the EU's approach, but you've hinted at the fact, or you've outlined the fact that there are obviously various levels of engagement on the African side. So there's the African Union, there's individual member states or individual states, and then obviously the ACP and other regional groupings. Where do you see in Africa the agency being primarily articulated, or where would Africa as a continent see agency be primarily articulated? Is it with the African Union? Is it particular states that drive that? Or are there perhaps also particular states that would like more precedence in that a predominance in that process? So just to get a clearer understanding of the actors on the African side.
Right. Thanks very much for that question. So I should say, in the context of this work, we very much focus on the African Union because it's in a way, it's the sort of culmination of all the actors that you've just been talking about. But another reason we focus on the African Union is that it's also the space where any type of tiny agency individual countries could have, they can pool it in this particular regional organization to then exercise it. But thirdly, it is also supposed to be, you know, the organization that stands opposite the European Union, given how we've now evolved. So, you know, when we're talking about the summits, for example, the spaces where this contestation is happening, where you sort of see it being quite visceral, it's in the context of the summits between the EU and the AU. Now, that does not mean that there aren't particularly powerful countries that are sort of perhaps pushing or articulating their discomfort, sometimes disgust at this, the ways in which they feel that the European Union is still treating African countries. And we certainly see this, say, in the context of the Sahel, for example. The Sahel is an area that France is very strong. It was strong before Mali, it was strong before Niger. It is also, it's an area where a lot of, especially the Anglophone former colonies have often been uncomfortable with France's influence there. Now, you would expect, of course, if you go with sort of the EU's own narrative of, you know, we never colonized anyone, that well, actually it should be trying to challenge France's power in that area. But then why would we expect it? After all, the European Union is constitutive of its member states. So it would simply leverage it. But the ways in which it's leveraged has also been problematic. And that's where we sort of see this, you know, we want to deal with counterterrorism. Okay, that's fine. You probably have a lot of allies in Africa who want you to deal with counterterrorism. So why not do it in the context of the Economic Community for West African States, on the one hand, but actually it might be better to do it through the African Union because there are countries that border who are not in ECOWAS, but ECOWAS has existing capabilities with regards to peace and security. But if you did that, you have to then listen to what Nigeria has to say. And it doesn't always have good things to say, but you have to listen because that's what agency is. You know, you have to take the good and the bad. So how do we circumvent that? Well, we put more money into this, what used to be an ad hoc grouping of smaller Francophonie, mainly Francophonie states, who perhaps don't have the same type of voice as the larger countries in the region. And then we can say, hey, we're doing something on counterterrorism. Is it consistent with what all of the countries in the region think would be appropriate for sort of a sustainable sustainable security? Because of course, the idea of counterterrorism itself can be quite problematic. Who knows? But the EU is doing counterterrorism and it doesn't really have to listen to this, it doesn't have to engage with those countries. And we sort of, and it doesn't preclude the EU from, say, supporting security sector reform mechanisms in ECOWAS, for example, but at the same time, using the excuse of capacity building to basically circumvent the open borders that exist within West Africa. So we can travel within West African countries, but because the EU states don't like that, the ability to do that then means that countries, based on international agreements they've signed with each other, they cannot necessarily check for migrants who might be coming to Europe. The EU says, okay, we'll support you to rewrite your national rules to ensure that you actually do that, in contravention of what has been established in the regional context here. And so you definitely then see that a lot of, the larger countries, Nigeria, South Africa, to a certain extent, are quite, to put it nicely, annoyed. Increasingly so, where actually previously we saw large space for tolerance, but increasingly so quite annoyed at what it is that the EU is doing, and are engaging more and more with other actors that don't put those sort of constraints on them.